afternoon. Thank you all so much for staying. I'm sure it's been a rather long day, and I'm about to take you out of your comfort zone a little bit as we enter this new realm of art. The exhibition Invented Worlds of Valton Tyler reflects the Amon Carter's ongoing mission to recognize and celebrate regional artists and bring their work into the larger conversation of American art. In fact, it's really thanks to regional collectors that I fell upon Tyler's work, because he's not represented in, you can't find him in any history of art books, and for that matter, any history of Texas art books. Why is this? In part, it's because Tyler is a self-taught artist, but he does not fit easily into categories or labels such as folk or outsider artist. Titles often given to individuals who never received any academic training, which is Tyler, who never did. So last fall at the Amon Carter, we featured two exhibitions. One was Self-Taught Genius, Treasures from the American Folk Art Museum, which was from New York City. And then in the Texas Gallery, I devoted it to Texas folk artists of the state. So if you look at these particular works, these were two artists with very decisive religious beliefs, and that they wanted to get those beliefs out as directly as possible. And you can see the lack of training here, because there's a lack of perspective. There's just almost, I think one artist called these marshmallow people, that Reverend Johnny Swearingen just had so much faith he needed to get it out on the canvas. Well, how do you categorize an artist who paints like this, who never had any academic training? And this is the way Tyler is able to paint. And when you get into the show, I think you'll have a really unique opportunity to look at these paintings closely for an artist who never had any training, to understand light perspective, depth, recession, color relationships. All of this comes together in Tyler's work in a very sophisticated manner. Although Tyler never really received any academic training, he's a very spiritual person as well, although it doesn't necessarily come through, that sort of iconography, whereas those works I showed you, you understood that Reverend Johnny Swearingen was showing the inside of a church. What he does is kind of create his own iconography that I'll go through today and talk about. At his current home in Garland, Texas, where Tyler continues to paint, and purely from his imagination, he says, quote, "I see another world." And he depicts visually elaborate scenes of personal symbolism. Now, to give you a little bit of background on Tyler, he was born in 1944, and he grew up in Texas City on the Gulf Coast, a town dominated by oil refineries. His father ran an auto body repair shop and was a skilled mixer of colors for car exteriors. His mother was a homemaker and devout Protestant, whose strict religious beliefs would influence Tyler's spiritual ideology for the rest of his life. Shortly after Tyler's third birthday, on April 16, 1947, a freighter in the port of Texas City, loaded with more than 2,000 tons of fertilizer, ignited and exploded, setting off massive fires as other ships, a nearby chemical plant, and a refinery went up in flames. The blast shattered windows as far away as Houston and was felt 100 miles to the northeast in Louisiana. Tyler said he recalls the red burning sky and the feeling that it was the end of the world. The artist's memories of this disaster often come through in some of his works, as you see here, where the idea of scaffolding, the remnants of Texas City and the oil refineries, and also the blackened backdrop, that scene of that smoke that sometimes influenced the way he saw his world. But Tyler's path to becoming an artist was a difficult journey. In his teens, he pursued his scientific and artistic curiosities. He designed an artificial human leg and a model for a spaceship, but it wasn't until he started drawing that he really found his true calling. He said, quote, "As I drew lines in a plain notebook, I watched as magically they became something with a shape and a spirit of their own. I became aware that what I was doing was something special, something I would never want to stop doing." In his 20s, Tyler enrolled in a commercial art school in Dallas, but only attended a few classes. He often relied on the financial and emotional support of his older brother, Robert Tyler, who would take Valton's work around to galleries in Dallas. Valton and his brother Robert's relationship was a lot like Vincent van Gogh and his brother Theo van Gogh, whose unfailing financial and emotional support allowed Vincent van Gogh to devote himself entirely to his art. In fact, Vincent van Gogh is one of Tyler's artistic heroes. It wasn't until 1970 when Robert Tyler took some of his brother's drawings to Valley House Gallery in Dallas to show the founder and director, Donald Vogel, that Tyler found a champion for his art. Donald Vogel thought that the graphic medium might be a natural direction for the artist to explore and provided an introduction for him to the artist who ran the printmaking department, Lawrence Shoulder, and the dean of the school, Dr. William Jordan. They too recognized that Tyler had a true raw talent that needed to be nurtured. So with no prior knowledge or experience, Tyler began etching plates and pulling prints, working all night sometimes and sleeping on the floor of the workshop. I just visited an artist named Sherry Owens who was a student at the time, and she remembered that they would come in, and at that time it was okay to smoke in a printmaking workshop, and there'd be a mound of cigarettes, and Tyler would literally be asleep across the printing press. So he became, this was really an important moment in his life. He created 50 separate intaglio prints that range from aqua tints to soft ground and line etchings between 1970 and 1972 that are now a part of the Amon Carter's permanent collection, thanks to a very generous gift of the Dallas photographer David H. Gibson. It's really this body of prints that provides the core of the exhibition, and part of my reasoning for providing the core of the exhibition was also the fact that this was the moment in Tyler's life that really gave him the confidence to go on and become an artist. So this is the first work he created at SMU in 1970. And you can see all he did was start drawing on the plate and following lines and incising the image. That's how you create this type of intaglio print. And you see here, and what was fun was he came for a preview of the show, and he came up to this and he said, "Oh, I was thinking of Van Gogh at this moment." But it's hard for us to see Van Gogh necessarily in this work. But his iconography reflects a lack of, though it reflects a lack of academic training, it also reflects his lack of stylistic trends. But at that moment in 1970s, early 1970s, Texas was very much a liberated cultural environment. And it really might have played a role in Tyler's burgeoning. In fact, as we go back and think about the state and its graphic and its geographic isolation, sort of from the competitive worlds of the East and West Coast, it often allowed artists an unencumbered sense of creative freedom. So the show that Katie mentioned that's up right now, Abstract Texas, about mid-century modern painting, we know that there were, and this is the show that you'll hopefully have a chance to see, that there was different artists in the state: George Grimmer of Fort Worth, Ben Colwell of Dallas, Seymour Fogel of Austin, Robert Pruser of Houston, who became some of the state's first modernists. These artists, along with works by James Boynton, Michael Frary, and Donald Wiseman, are currently featured in the Texas Gallery. They were undeterred by the lack of support from galleries, museum, and patrons. And Grammer, Fogel, Colwell, and Pruser, along with artists Jack Boynton, Michael Frary, and Donald Wiseman, advanced their own abstract visions in the middle of the 20th century. These painters created singular works that rivaled New York progressive art circles' ideas. In referring to working in Texas, Jack Boynton said, "It has been a place where you just do it because you want to do it. There's never been a lot of encouragement, although I guess there has been enough to keep some artists afloat here and there. But the same token, there has not been much pressure to do anything particular." In moving up in time and looking at the 1960s, Fort Worth native Dave Hickey opened a gallery in Austin called A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. And it ran from 67 to 71. And what Hickey did was establish a niche for unconventional contemporary art by young Texas artists that was further developed by Henry Hopkins, director of the Fort Worth Art Museum, which is now the Museum of Modern Art at Fort Worth, and from 1969 to 1974, gallery owners Janie Lee and Murray Smither of Dallas and Federica Hunter of Houston sort of helped support this burgeoning contemporary art. in the early 1970s. In his 1972 article entitled "The Texas to New York via Nashville Semi-Transcontinental Epiphany Tactic," Hickey reflected on what it meant to be an artist in Texas. Quote, "Home in the 20th century is less where your heart is than where you understand the sons of bitches, especially in Texas, where it is the vitality of the sons of bitches which makes everything possible, where there is more voracious mercantile energy, more vanity, and more pretentiousness than any place I've been, excepting Manhattan. Of such stuff are cultural communities made. It is that sense of possibility which has been able to sustain itself that I most value. It is a quality which must be spent. You cannot hoard it in memory and nostalgia, or it will dwindle like an uninvested capital." In the same year, in 1972, Newsweek ran a story about a rambunctious group of young, talented, media-savvy Dallas artists who became known as the Oak Cliff Four, sometimes the Five, because you see 5 artists here. Mac Whitney sometimes exhibited with them, sometimes didn't, and they were featured in Dave Hickey's gallery down in Austin as well. During the interview in 1972, Jack Mims said, quote, "This may be a perverse attitude, but we want to see if we can succeed out here on our own," end quote. Almost like Texas, like a new frontier. These artists shared an irreverent sensibility. Wade liked to call theirs Texas weird aesthetic. And yes, Bob Wade studied at Berkeley. He was picked up by one of Dallas's first contemporary galleries, Chapman Kelly, making a name for himself painting giant paintings of hot dogs, or weenies, that reflected his unabashed, outrageous humor. In fact, artists of the group, from George Green's drawings of cockroach hairstyles, as you see on the left, or Jim Roche's mama plants in ceramics, there was a mood of artistic anarchy and unrestrained creative freedom existed in Texas in the early 1970s. It was also an era of mutual support. It was described by art critic Janet Kuttner like this, quote, "It was a whole different kind of thing from today. The climate was different, very freewheeling. There was an esprit de corps that existed then that didn't exist before or since. It was a time when we all really worked together. The museums, the artists, the dealers, people like Murray Smither, Janie C. Lee, people like Henry Hopkins," end quote. Tyler felt the effects of this Texas esprit de corps with vocal and shoulder support for his art. Whatever image appeared in Tyler's mind, he captured it in the print series. Here we have Homage to Galileo from 1970. And this print reflects Tyler's fascination with Renaissance men, such as Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo Galilei, here creating a composition of floating cones and planetary forms that suggest the discoveries of the 17th century Italian astronomer and father of modern science. Like the engineering pursuits of Galileo and Da Vinci, Tyler himself envisions his own world, where his mechanical apparatuses function, like his design for creating pillows in Pillow Machine, or his own envisioning of a music box. But what we also see here are reoccurring motives that to Tyler reference the divine. One of those is the sphere that you see over and over again. And this implies the earth, humanity, and creation in general. Rarely do you see human figures in Tyler's work. There's only a few instances, there's only actually 2 prints in the show where you'll see a recognizable human figure. It's because his forms, he considers all of his forms that he depicts as being spiritual and alive and communicating with one another. And I think they are surrogates for human beings. Let's go east, where the shapes bend and lean towards one another as if in conversation together. Cones reappear here, making sound. He said about this print, I associate the shapes with an Eastern feeling. The sharp pointed forms also reminded me of the letter E and the sound of E. So I entitled it, Let's Go East. Sound is very important to Tyler. In fact, he has quite a gift. He taught himself how to play classical music on the piano with no training whatsoever. The sound of bells, this was done without a design in mind, he said. The spreading forms reminded me of Christmas, and the other shapes evolved as I thought of the sound of Christmas bells. It was simply a feeling for sound I was concentrating on at the time. The entire design is like sound with leaves. So Tyler sort of embodies that idea of synesthesia, where the different sound and vision all comes together and he sees it kind of coming together in his mind and then puts it forth on the paper or in canvas. Heritage, as I worked, he said, the forms began to look like huge garlands of organic bodies, framing an environment. The building below became into design as it reminded me of a stereo cabinet. That's often what's fun about Tyler's work, is if you look long enough, you'll see something that's very recognizable. There, a 70s stereo cabinet. And above looks very organic, almost like an intestine. But to him, just a very organic, symbolic shape. He said the whole design reminded me of belonging to something or to some time, so I entitled it Heritage. Another theme that's pervasive in Tyler's work is the theme of time and travel. This fossil ship is a fossil of an image that he said happened maybe 100 billion years ago. But time means to me, for instance, throwing the mind so far away that the spectator wouldn't think of himself as involved. It's like a new world, or a search for one. Here's another print where you see almost like a tree house at the top, but then a combination of these different forms. When I asked him, why do all your forms have slits? He said, because they have to breathe. He said, quote, these forms are at a family gathering, talking and having a good time. Adults and children are gossiping and sharing their news. The fluttering objects could be their conversation. I wanted to create another monumental landscape, but in a soft atmosphere that you could feel closer to. The structures have doors and windows that could suggest eyes and mouths, but you are to go in the buildings and walk around them. Another thing that you see often in his work are these flying particles, and I think part of that is the memory of the Texas City disaster. Because he expanded the idea in this particular work, Space Eagles, where those tiny scrawling forms become what he's created as Space Eagles. And at first, it seems like a relatively, sort of at first glance, maybe happy work. But then you notice down below, there's a medieval battle scene going on, almost between a fortress, and these could be bombs being dropped. So in one level, Tyler works on this ominous mood where you see here, but then in A Newborn Day, you have a buoyant, very optimistic mood. This is almost suggesting a futuristic utopia. And he used that central circular motif and the lines radiating out to suggest this sort of uplift, emotional uplift, and these biomorphic buildings bordered by checkered walls that you see here. Here's also you can see picket fences. He called this Old Mother Hubbard wearing her bonnet on top. A salute to a sphere is where he's taken the sphere idea, but made it a crowning dome for a citadel. And while there's this whimsical touch of a drop-down door, he said he intended this to, quote, make you feel an inner quietness out of respect for the main shape. Now, when Tyler finished his print series, he'd never attempted painting before. And Donald Vogel and his wife encouraged him to try painting. He said, I'm afraid of color. And they said, we think you should try it just to see what how you can express yourself. And so one of his earliest forays, this is columns from 1972, speaks to his taking a lot of those motifs that you saw in the prints and putting them into a painting. And here his color is more subdued, the palette's more subdued, but he said, quote, when I started painting, that was real freedom. In fact, the print series is the only print series he's ever done, so he's remained primarily a painter and a draftsman. His liberated sense of depicting his visions on a larger scale and in color is reflected in the joyous feeling of this composition, as the spherical heads of the columns seem to smile at one another. The landscape setting is another reoccurring motive of virtually all the artist's work, and it suggests his lifelong roots in Texas and its wide open geographic plains. Here in 1975, you see him going more so into deep, rich, saturated color, and that's where his art could end up. He could play with color in any way he wanted and feel comfortable about it. Working on a large scale, he also, as you walk through the exhibition, you'll see he kept expanding his scale, so his paintings keep getting larger. Guardian of 1973, he found that color aided in his goal to express his otherworldly visions and personify his forms, as seen here in the giant plant-like shapes that evoke a benevolent quality, as one large plant form seemed to protect the smaller one in the background. And I just have to share with you that, we tour thousands of children through our museum, and all the children get this picture without even being told the title of it. They say, oh, the larger plant's protecting the smaller one. So there's something about Tyler's vision that connects very much. I think it's a very uninhibited sort of, in some ways, kind of like that innocent childlike view that he's able to put forth and that children immediately relate to. Standing still, we see her almost a very livable and non-livable still life that he's created. It's not surprising that Tyler's inscrutable paintings of these hybrid creatures like we see here has spurred comparisons to artists like Salvador Dali, the surrealist. Beginning in the late 1910s and early 1920s, and drawing on the ideas of Sigmund Freud's dream studies, writers and visual artists of the surrealist movement started working automatically from their subconscious to release their uninhibited minds. So painters like Dali, Max Ernst, René Magritte, Jean Moreau, and Yves Tanguy, among others, often composed illogical scenes, incorporating everyday objects or fantastic figures within these vast dreamscapes. Though Tyler told me that when he connects to God, because he thinks of his work as a spiritual meditation, he calls it another dimension. Not in terms of what the surrealists were trying to do, which is that they were reacting to what had happened in World War I and what they were seeing as the irrational world, the crumbling of the ideal world of humanity. That's not what Tyler's trying to do. This is what he sees in his mind and feels he has to get down onto the canvas. Sometimes his works are a little more specific, a little more literal, like the clock, which you see here, and it looks like a clock with his paintbrush down in front that indicates his presence here. But time is another theme, and he expresses it much less literally in a lot of his works, where craters, and you see craters here, craters to him are like time, and that's the symbol, if you think of the early Earth and the explosion and the craters and how they evoke time, that's how Tyler sees them. So Give Us Sound, which is one of the last large paintings in the show, it's about time and space and sound, and they're communicated abstractly, but all coming together. And it's really like, if you look at it, his sophisticated ability, and this is all Tyler teaching himself, understanding about the relationship between blues and reds and the way they reverberate, and understanding that this creates a push, red and blue together, plus the mustard yellow, a push-pull sensation that kind of creates the sense of rhythm and movement that he was trying to create in this work. And then at the back, you have all these particular craters that is evoking time. Other symbols that show up again and again to Tyler are the horns. And to him, they're a biblical symbol of power. You can see them throughout, and they'll show up again and again in his particular paintings, but in different ways. So what he's able to do is really create a very sophisticated composition for an artist who's really going from what he sees in his mind, but is also being true to his spiritual beliefs. But I hope that you all will have the opportunity to come over and see the show and look at the works in person, because there's a dramatic difference when you can see the works in person. I also want to mention that there was a catalog we sold out in the bookstore, a hard copy catalog that was available, but Kevin Vogel of Valley House Gallery still has copies for sale if you're interested. There's also an ebook for sale. If you just go to the Amon Carter website and the bookstore, you're able to purchase the ebook as well. Do you all have any questions? Yes?
One of the most striking things is his line work. It's so precise. Do you have a sense of how he's working? Do you have his drawings or drafts of things? Did it just spring fully formed like that?
You know, that's a great question, and there's a clip in the show, and I went over to his house, and I was talking to him and I was interviewing him, and then he just lost interest and started drawing. And I was sort of standing there like, and what happens is, and what's remarkable is that he started drawing like a semicircle, and it was almost as if, you know, I mean, he's older now and is, you know, not as pristine as his lines used to be, but it was just coming out. And there's a clip in the show that's part of a documentary that Edward Gomez created that shows him drawing. But he had this very precise sense of line, and it was remarkable that when he went into make the prints, you see all those very pristine lines that he created. Now, he might have used, in some of those instances, you know, a ruler to make it exact, like in a newborn day. But it is really astonishing watching him work and just it coming out, just coming straight out, as he describes it. It's what he sees. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes?
Do you know if he traveled Texas very much?
He stayed primarily throughout his life in Texas. He did have a showing one time. There was a New York dealer who represented artists kind of more of Tyler's ilk, where they were not necessarily the academically trained artist. And he went up to New York for a month because he had family there. But throughout his entire life, he remained in Texas.
I had another question.
Yeah.
Did you get a sense of other influences from more recent or more contemporaneous when he was working? Like William T. Wiley, Philip Guston, even Robert Indiana with his Herms?
You know, it's interesting that you bring up that question, because in some ways when he was studying, he would read just old master history books. But he only gravitated to a few artists, according to his memory. Vincent van Gogh and Leonardo da Vinci, and then Peter Paul Rubens from the Baroque era. But then, in a conversation, he mentioned Mark Rothko. So it makes me, you know, I think he had, as he got older, he became more sophisticated and looked at other artists. But when, in the 70s, when someone first said to him, "Your work looks like Dali," he said, "Who is that?" And I believe he didn't know who Dali was at that point. I think he learned afterwards, obviously, he looked at Dali. But he doesn't, I mean, if you look at his work, what's interesting is it's this constant recombination, and it's fresh, too, the way he does it. But he takes these forms that, you know, inhabit his mind and then puts them down. There's a great Sherlock Holmes painting, and I love the title because it's like the mystery of, you know, Sherlock Holmes and trying to solve a mystery. And it's these giant, sort of horn-like fig, you know, it's like a giant, almost sea-life creature. But it's like his own iconography that keeps coming through. Any other questions?
How's his health?
He's got a lot of health issues. He came to the opening and we were so pleased to have him there. He's got some diabetes and heart issues, and so, you know, he's got, fortunately, family living with him now and giving him some support, so I think that's great.
Does he have a family, like children and so on?
You know, it's funny because, yes, he did. He was married briefly, and he has a daughter and grandchildren. And the daughter and grandchildren came, the two grandchildren came to the show. And so his daughter and granddaughter have moved in with him right now, helping him out. So, yeah, it's his biography. He doesn't reveal a whole lot. So, you know, some of these things come through snippets of conversations, or then he called me up and said, "Is it okay if my daughter comes to?" And I realized he had a daughter. I'm like, "Of course she can come to the opening." So, any other questions? Yes.
Is he still producing a lot?
He's still producing. I think he's, when I went in, he had been working on a large-scale painting. He still works on a very large scale. And it's, you walk into his house and just immediately this large-scale painting is facing you. So the art takes over the house that he'd been working on for quite some time. But he also, as I mentioned, as I was talking to him, he'll just go back and start drawing as well. So his two outlets are really the drawing and the painting. Any other questions?
How did you discover it?
I was at a private collector's home, and there was this large-scale painting, and I said, "Who's this?" And the person said, "That's Valton Tyler." And so from that moment, I started investigating him, and then it was almost serendipity. David Gibson, the Dallas photographer, just has been a long-time supporter of the museum, and we appreciate his support so much. Called up the museum and said, "I've got this rare The Print series that Tyler did, and I'd love to gift it to the museum." And so we were, of course, thrilled to accept it, and then it helped create the core of this exhibition. It was an original series of 50 prints, so they're not all in the show because I wanted to incorporate paintings so that people could look at the way he moved, from the print to the painting. Any other questions? Well, I hope you all will join us over at the Carter. The reception starts at 5:30, and Andrew Walker, our director, will be there. He's been at a director's conference. I think he's flying back in right now. Should be here hopefully, and so I hope you will be there. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to come up to me at the museum. I will be there. Thank you so much.